There are so many things to think about when you produce an essay. It's quite nice sometimes to know what you don't need to worry about. So I'm going to go through 6 things you don't need to have in your essay. The first thing is that you don't need to underline your headings. It looks a bit old-fashioned now to have headings underlined. It clutters up the text. It makes it more difficult to access what it is that you're trying to say. So it's worth getting out of the habit of underlining headings now. If you're handwriting something and you think your headings wouldn't really be clear unless they had underlining, that's fine. But because when you're typing you can embolden the text, if you have text in bold, there's no need to worry about underlining it. You also don't need to indent at the start of paragraphs. This is a really difficult habit to get out of, but for some people, when they go to a new paragraph, on the first line they just tab in one and there's a little indent. There's no need to do it, but sometimes people have been told to do it in school and they can't quite get out of the habit. It's not a huge thing, it's not a rule, it's just a convention. So if you really, really like the look of your writing that way and that feels comfortable to you, fine, do it. But just be aware that wouldn't be the most usual way to introduce a paragraph. Titles can feel difficult in terms of how you're going to produce them, but actually the rule is quite simple. If you have a title of something that's been published, such as a book or a play, for example, then you don't need to have inverted commas around the title of that book or play. What you need to do is to put it in italics. The words, so Hamlet just goes in italics, no single inverted commas around the word Hamlet. Usually for smaller pieces such as a chapter in a book or a single poem, you usually have inverted commas around those and no italics. You're just saying this is part of something, a collection of things to have been published, for example a collection of poems or a whole book. Of course, if you have a huge long poem like The Prelude, for example, then that has been published in its own right and that would then go back to being in italics. We sometimes ask you to use Times New Roman, in which case you've got to use it, but it's not a very nice looking font. It's quite difficult for some people to read and it looks rather old-fashioned now. So if we tell you you have to use Times New Roman, you're going to have to use it. Other than that, start thinking about other fonts that you like. Professionally, you're most likely to be using either Arial or Calibri, and Calibri is starting to become far more common than it used to be. So probably by the time you graduate, Calibri will be the font you'll be expected to use. Whilst none of this is hugely important in terms of what you're going to be doing overall, it's just worth noting that when you start work, that's the way people know, oh, you're the new graduate in the office, because you're using what often is called professionally university font. So it's one of those things you might just want to be aware of. We mark everything anonymously, so we don't expect to see a name on a piece of work or in a file name for a piece of work, and we're very comfortable with that process. We want to look at the piece of work in its entirety, in the context with which you present it to us, but not in the context of your name. In fact, it can feel quite uncomfortable for us if we're marking a piece of work and we can see a name in the file name or in the piece of work itself. So unless for some reason we've asked you for it, we don't need your name on your essay, but please do put your student number in the file name of your submission, because we need to know where that mark's going to go. The final point is actually the most difficult, but it's about practice, it's about developing your writing style. You don't need to write to a formula. We don't, for example, need you to define every important term in the essay title. We don't need you constantly putting forward a point and then giving an example of that point and then expanding on that point and then moving on to the next paragraph or set of paragraphs. Those things work really well at school and college, but they tend to hamper students far more when they get to university. So if you have a loose idea of how you like to write things, that's absolutely fine. I wouldn't put you off that at all, but try not to be too formulaic in what you produce. Instead, make a good plan. Make a plan to whatever level of detail you think would help you in your writing, and then work from that. A good plan keeps you grounded, but it allows you to be free-ranging in your style of writing and in the way in which you want to develop your points and make your argument. So, 6 things you'll never have to worry about again in your essays.